The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3:15 when Samuel Harmon pushed open the mahogany door to his Pacific Heights estate. His Italian leather shoes echoed against the marble floor as he stepped inside, earlier than usual, driven home by a meeting that had been canceled at the last minute. He loosened his silk tie, exhaled the tension of another pretend normal day at the office, and set his briefcase down on the console table. That's when he heard it, a sound he hadn't heard in 6 long months. Laughter. Not the polite, hushed kind that staff exchanged in corners, but genuine, unrestrained joy bubbling up from somewhere deep in the house. Samuel moved toward the sound, his heart beginning to pound in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. The laughter led him to the sunlit living room where afternoon light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, on the plush carpet near the fireplace, sat the new housekeeper with his son. Jordan, his 6-month-old son, the baby three different specialists had confirmed was born permanently blind, was staring directly into the young woman's face. Not past her, not through her, at her. And he was smiling, that gummy, whole-face smile that babies give when they're not just content but genuinely delighted. Samuel's briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a thunderous crack that seemed to stop time itself. The housekeeper's head snapped up, her dark eyes wide with something Samuel couldn't quite name. Fear, relief, both. But Jordan turned his head toward the sound, turned toward his father, and looked directly at him. Samuel felt the room tilt, his knees weakened, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. "That's not possible," he whispered, though no one but the universe was listening. How was this possible? How could the son doctors swore would never see anything, never recognize anyone, never respond to visual stimuli of any kind, be tracking movement and making eye contact like any typical baby? The answer, Samuel would learn over the next 72 hours, would shatter every truth he'd built his grief upon. It would expose a conspiracy so cruel, so calculated, that it would test the very limits of his faith in humanity. But it would also reveal something else, something about the mysterious woman now rising slowly from the floor with his son in her arms, something about the way God works through people we least expect, in moments when hope seems furthest away. 6 months and 3 days before that afternoon, Samuel Harmon had stood in a sterile delivery room at San Francisco General Hospital, watching his entire world crumble in real time. Victoria had been in labor for 14 hours. Everything had proceeded normally, textbook, the doctors kept saying. A healthy baby boy born at 6:47 a.m., 7 pounds 6 ounces, with a lusty cry that filled the delivery room with promise. Samuel had cut the umbilical cord with trembling hands, tears of joy streaming down his face. He'd kissed Victoria's sweaty forehead and whispered, "We did it. He's perfect. You're perfect." She'd smiled at him, exhausted but radiant, and said, "Go meet our son. I'll be right here." Those were the last coherent words she ever spoke to him. Samuel had spent 20 glorious minutes in the nursery, watching nurses weigh and measure Jordan, marveling at his son's tiny fingers and perfect little nose. He'd called his mother his best friend, sent photos to everyone in his contacts. His heart had felt too large for his chest, bursting with a love he'd never known existed. Then the code blue alarm had shattered everything. He'd run back to Victoria's room to find it swarming with medical personnel. Crash cart, shouting, organized chaos that spoke of desperate measures. A nurse had caught him at the door, held him back, tried to explain words he couldn't process, hemorrhaging, blood pressure dropping, doing everything they could. Samuel had fought past her, reached Victoria's bedside. Her eyes had been open but unfocused, her skin already taking on a waxy pallor he'd only seen in funeral homes. "Vic," he'd choked out, grabbing her hand. "Vic, stay with me, please. Jordan needs you, I need you." For one brief moment, her eyes had cleared. She'd squeezed his hand with what little strength remained and whispered something he'd never be sure he heard correctly. "Take care of our boy, don't let anyone." Then nothing, her hand went slack, the monitor flatlined. And despite 15 more minutes of desperate resuscitation attempts, Victoria Harmon died at 10:03 a.m., 3 hours and 16 minutes after giving birth to their son. Their son, who at that very moment was sleeping peacefully in the nursery, completely unaware that he would never know his mother's touch, never hear her voice, never see her smile. Samuel had collapsed in a chair outside the delivery room and sobbed until he had no tears left, until his throat was raw, until hospital security gently suggested he might want to call someone to drive him home. But he couldn't go home, his son was here, his motherless 3-hour-old son needed him. So Samuel had dried his face, steadied his breathing, and gone back to the nursery. He'd held Jordan for the first time as a widower, as a single father, as a man whose future had just been rewritten in the cruelest possible way. "It's just us now, buddy," he'd whispered into Jordan's soft blonde hair. "But I promise you I will be enough, I will love you enough for both of us. I will make sure you never feel the hole she left behind." It was a promise he meant with every fiber of his being. A promise he tried desperately to keep over the following weeks, even as grief threatened to drown him. The funeral had been a blur, 300 people, most of whom he didn't remember speaking to. Victoria's parents flying in from Connecticut, their faces masks of incomprehension. His own mother trying to help with Jordan, trying to help with food, trying to help with everything while he tried simply to survive each minute. The estate in Pacific Heights, the home he and Victoria had purchased just 18 months ago, the one she'd spent months decorating, the one she'd loved for its views and its light, had become a mausoleum. Every room echoed with her absence. Every corner held memories that stabbed like knives. But Samuel had tried, God, how he'd tried. He'd hired a night nurse for the first few weeks, but quickly realized he couldn't stand the sound of anyone else comforting his son. He'd taken over the midnight feedings himself, the diaper changes, the rocking and shushing and soothing. He'd spent hours in the nursery. Victoria had painted soft blues that reminded her of her childhood summers on Cape Cod, warm yellows like the Tuscan sunlight from their honeymoon, whispering stories to Jordan about the mother he would never remember. Your mom painted this room herself, he'd say, walking Jordan around the nursery at 2 a.m. She stood on a ladder, 5 months pregnant, insisting she had to get the colors just right. She wanted you to wake up every morning surrounded by light and love. Jordan would gurgle and coo, his tiny hands grasping at Samuel's shirt, and for those moments, Samuel felt something like peace. Like maybe they could do this. Like maybe Victoria was still with them somehow, watching over them, helping them find their way. Then came the 6-week checkup that changed everything. Dr. Helena Crane had been highly recommended, board certified in pediatric ophthalmology, affiliated with UCSF Medical Center, with a calm, professional demeanor that initially put Samuel at ease. The appointment was supposed to be routine, a standard vision screening that all babies received around 6 weeks of age. Samuel had brought Jordan in, expecting nothing more than confirmation that his son's eyes were developing normally. Instead, Dr. Crane had spent an unusually long time examining Jordan, shining lights, making notes, testing pupil reflexes. Her expression had grown increasingly serious with each passing minute. Finally, she'd set down her instruments and turned to Samuel with a look he would never forget, a mixture of professional sympathy and something else he couldn't quite identify. Mr. Harmon, I need to run some additional tests, but I'm seeing some concerning signs here. Jordan's pupils aren't responding to light stimulation the way they should, his tracking is essentially non-existent, and his optic nerve appears significantly underdeveloped. Samuel had felt his stomach drop. What does that mean? I'd like to schedule him for an MRI and some more comprehensive testing before I make any definitive statements, but I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that Jordan may have a serious visual impairment. The word blind hadn't been spoken that day, but it had hung in the air between them like a death sentence. The tests had followed over the next 2 weeks. MRI, visual evoked potential studies, electroretinography, each one requiring Samuel to hold his tiny son still, to watch him cry and squirm, to carry him home afterward and rock him to sleep while whispering desperate prayers into the darkness. Then came the follow-up appointment. Dr. Crane had invited Samuel into her office, a bad sign in itself. Doctors didn't invite you into offices to deliver good news. She'd sat across from him, her desk a barrier between them, and destroyed what remained of his world. Mr. Harmon, I'm very sorry to tell you this, but the tests confirm my initial concerns. Jordan has a condition called optic nerve hypoplasia. In simple terms, his optic nerves didn't develop properly in utero. They're too small to transmit visual information to his brain effectively. Samuel had stared at her, his brain struggling to process the words. Can it be fixed? Surgery, treatment? Unfortunately, no. Optic nerve hypoplasia is permanent. The nerves can't erase or be surgically repaired. Jordan is functionally blind, and he will remain so for the rest of his life. The room had spun. Samuel had gripped the arms of his chair, fighting against the nausea rising in his throat. What does that mean for him, for his life? It means he'll never see faces, including yours. He won't perceive light, color, or movement. He'll need to learn to navigate the world through his other senses, hearing, touch, spatial awareness. There are excellent schools and resources for blind children, and many lead full, productive lives. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Harmon. This will be challenging, especially given your recent loss. You'll need a strong support system. Samuel had barely heard the rest of the conversation. Something about early intervention programs, adaptive specialists, support groups for parents of blind children. The words had washed over him like white noise, meaningless against the roar of his grief. Victoria had died giving birth to a son who would never see her photograph, never see the room she'd lovingly painted for him, never see his father's face or know what sunlight looked like or watch clouds drift across the sky. The cruelty of it had been unbearable. Samuel had driven home in a daze, Jordan sleeping in his car seat, oblivious to the diagnosis that had just been handed down. He'd carried his son inside, stood in that blue and yellow nursery, and wept openly for the first time since Victoria's funeral. "I'm so sorry," he'd whispered to Jordan. "I'm so sorry you'll never see any of this. Your mom worked so hard, she wanted you to see all of it." Jordan had made soft baby sounds, his eyes, those beautiful blue eyes that looked so normal, staring at nothing. From that day forward, Samuel had tried everything to reach his son. He'd bought toys that played music, thinking maybe Jordan could connect with sound, rattles that vibrated, books with different textures. He'd wave them in front of Jordan's face, desperately hoping for some flicker of recognition, some sign that maybe the doctors were wrong. Nothing. Jordan remained unresponsive, his body still, his eyes empty. Samuel had stopped going to his corporate law practice. His partners had been understanding initially, given the circumstances, but as weeks turned into months, concerned phone calls had started coming. He'd ignored them all. The house staff had begun to whisper. He'd overheard fragments of conversations, pity mixed with frustration. The cook had started leaving meals that went uneaten. Mr. Chen, the head of household who'd been with Samuel for 5 years, had taken on more responsibilities without being asked, managing schedules and groceries and everything Samuel couldn't bring himself to care about. 3 housekeepers had quit in rapid succession. The first had left after just 2 weeks, offering no explanation. The second had lasted a month before tearfully admitting she couldn't handle the atmosphere in the house. The third had made it 6 weeks before simply not showing up one morning, leaving a terse resignation letter on the kitchen counter. Samuel couldn't blame them. The estate had become a tomb. Curtains stayed drawn. Silence reigned except for Jordan's occasional cries, cries that Samuel responded to mechanically now, going through the motions of feeding, changing, and rocking without any real connection. Every night he'd stand at Jordan's crib and stare at his son. He'd think about Victoria, about the future they'd planned, about the thousands of moments his son would never experience. And he'd feel himself drowning in a darkness that had nothing to do with lack of sight and everything to do with absence of hope. "I don't know how to do this without her," he'd whisper to Jordan. "You're all I have left, but you don't even know I exist." Jordan never responded, never turned toward his voice, never gave any indication that he knew his father was there. That's when Mr. Chen had knocked on the nursery door one evening and said quietly, "Sir, I've hired a new housekeeper. She starts tomorrow." Samuel had nodded without turning around. "Fine. Her name is Angela Harris. She comes highly recommended. I've told her about the situation." Another nod. Samuel couldn't bring himself to care who the fourth housekeeper would be. She'd probably quit too, just like the others. Everyone left eventually. Everyone except him and a son who couldn't see him. What Samuel didn't know, couldn't possibly have known, was that Angela Harris would be different. She wouldn't quit, she wouldn't look away. And she would see what no one else had seen, the truth that would tear his world apart before finally setting it free. Angela Harris pressed her face against the window of the rideshare, watching the San Francisco hills roll past in the early morning fog. Her canvas duffel bag sat at her feet, everything she owned in the world fitting into one worn piece of luggage. 28 years old, and this was what our life had amounted to: no family, no permanent address, no one who'd notice if she disappeared tomorrow. The thought should have been depressing, but Angela had made peace with invisibility a long time ago. Sometimes being invisible was safer, easier, less painful. The car pulled up to massive iron gates flanked by stone pillars. Even through the fog, Angela could tell this wasn't just a house, it was an estate. The kind of place she'd cleaned but never lived in, where the family silver was probably worth more than she'd make in 5 years. The gates swung open silently and they drove up a winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured hedges. When the house came into view, Angela's breath caught. It was stunning, a modern architectural masterpiece of glass and steel, perched on the hillside like something from a magazine spread. It also looked unutterably sad, like a beautiful shell with nothing living inside. Mr. Chen was waiting at the front entrance, a slender man in his 60s, perfectly dressed, with a face that betrayed nothing. He paid the driver, nodded to Angela, and gestured for her to follow without a word of welcome. Inside, the house was immaculate: gleaming hardwood floors, minimalist furniture arranged with precision, original artwork on the walls, everything expensive, everything perfect, everything utterly lifeless. "Your quarters are this way," Mr. Chen said, his voice flat and professional. He led her through a gourmet kitchen that looked like it had never been cooked in, down a hallway to a small room off the back of the house. It was simple but clean: a bed, a dresser, a window overlooking fog-shrouded gardens, no personal touches, no warmth, just a space to sleep and exist. "You'll start at 6 a.m., Mr. Chen continued. Standard housekeeping duties, laundry, dusting, general cleaning. Mr. Harmon keeps to himself. You'll rarely see him. Do your work quietly. Don't ask questions. Don't disturb him or the baby. Angela nodded, setting her bag on the bed. Understood. Mr. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. The previous housekeepers, they found the atmosphere here difficult. If you feel overwhelmed, let me know immediately. Mr. Harmon doesn't need any more disruption. I won't quit, Angela said simply. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. 6 a.m. tomorrow, I'll show you your duties then. After he left, Angela sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. She'd taken this job because she needed work, needed a place to stay, needed something to fill the empty hours that made up her life. She'd grown up in the foster care system, 18 different homes before aging out at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a bone-deep exhaustion. For the past decade, she'd worked invisible jobs, night shift at hotels, cleaning offices after hours, folding laundry in the basements of houses where the families never learned her name. She was good at being invisible, good at seeing without being seen, good at reading the things people tried to hide. That night, as fog pressed against her window, Angela heard it, faint down some distant hallway, a baby crying. The sound went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. No soothing voice, no gentle shushing, just silence that felt worse than the crying had. Angela lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She'd heard Mr. Chen mention a baby, heard the cook whispering to a delivery person about the tragedy of Mrs. Harmon's death. What kind of house, she thought, turns grief into suffocating silence? What kind of place makes people quit rather than face whatever sadness lurks in its corners? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. And unlike the others, she wouldn't run from it. Angela's first 4 days passed in a blur of routine. Wake at 5:45 a.m., make her bed with hospital corners, move through the house like a ghost, dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting, vacuuming carpets with no footprints, folding towels that hadn't been used. She rarely saw Mr. Harmon. Once she glimpsed him leaving early in the morning, his suit perfectly pressed but his face haggard, like a man who hadn't really slept in months. Another time, she heard his voice from behind his study door, low, strained, talking to someone on the phone about work he couldn't focus on, cases he couldn't manage. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter. On the fifth morning, everything changed. Angela was dusting the living room, the big sun-filled space with floor-to-ceiling windows that should have been the heart of the home, but instead felt like a museum exhibit, when Mr. Chen walked past carrying something wrapped in a soft blue blanket. He set the bundle down carefully on a cushioned mat near the window, adjusted the edges, and turned to leave. That's when Angela saw it was a baby. 6 months old maybe, blonde hair catching the morning light, perfectly still on the mat. Staring at nothing. She froze, dust cloth in hand. Mr. Chen noticed her staring. That's Jordan, he said matter-of-factly, Mr. Harmon's son. Angela's throat tightened. The baby wasn't crying, wasn't moving, just lying there like a beautiful doll someone had carefully arranged. Is he okay? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Mr. Chen's face remained impassive. He's blind, can't see anything, can't hear properly either. His brain doesn't process things the way it should. Doctor says it's permanent. Angela looked at the baby, at Jordan. His eyes were open, blue and clear and absolutely beautiful, but they were fixed on nothing, tracking nothing, seeing nothing. Best not to bother with him, Mr. Chen added. He doesn't respond to voices or touch, just exists, really, tragic, but there's nothing to be done. He walked away, leaving Angela standing there with her dust cloth, staring at this tiny human who'd been written off by everyone around him. She should have gone back to work, should have followed orders, should have stayed in her invisible lane. But something pulled her forward, something she couldn't name, couldn't explain. An instinct honed from years of being overlooked, of being dismissed, of being told she didn't matter. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, and she saw in Jordan's stillness something that made her heart ache. Slowly, carefully, she knelt beside the mat, her knees touched the plush carpet, her shadow fell across Jordan's body. Hi, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nothing, not a flicker, not a movement. She waited, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath, watching his eyes stare at some point beyond her, beyond everything. Then, moving with the deliberate care of someone approaching a wild animal, Angela reached out. Her fingers hovered over Jordan's tiny hand, trembling slightly. She touched his palm, gentle, barely a brush of skin against skin. His fingers twitched. Angela's breath caught, she froze, not daring to move, not daring to hope. She stroked his palm again, soft, deliberate, a clear touch that said, I'm here, I see you. This time, Jordan's hand didn't just twitch, his fingers moved, curled, wrapped around her thumb with surprising firmness. Angela stared at their joined hands, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't random. This wasn't a reflex. This was a response. This was connection. You felt that, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Didn't you, sweetheart? You know I'm here. Jordan's grip tightened slightly around her thumb. His chest rose and fell. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point. But his hand was holding hers with intention, with awareness, with something that looked very much like need. Angela glanced toward the hallway, listening. Mr. Chen's footsteps had faded. The house was silent except for the ticking of a distant clock and her own ragged breathing. She stayed there for 5 more minutes, kneeling beside Jordan, letting him hold her thumb. When she finally carefully extracted her hand, his fingers opened slowly, reluctantly. She stood up, legs shaking, and backed away. Her mind was racing. That wasn't nothing, that was something. Something real and significant and completely at odds with everything Mr. Chen had told her. For the rest of that day, Angela moved through her duties in a daze. She couldn't stop thinking about Jordan's fingers wrapping around hers. Couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over, analyzing it, questioning it, trying to understand what it meant. That night, alone in her room, she pulled out her phone and started searching. Infant blindness signs, baby not responding to visual stimuli, misdiagnosed blindness in babies. Page after page of medical information flooded her screen. Some of it was technical, beyond her understanding, but certain phrases jumped out. Delayed visual development, cortical visual impairment, failure to track objects may be temporary. She kept digging, going deeper, following links down rabbit holes she probably shouldn't have been exploring. False blindness diagnosis, babies appearing blind when they're not. The results got darker, stories about medical malpractice, cases where children had been wrongly diagnosed, and then, horrifyingly, articles about something called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, caregivers who made people sick on purpose, who created symptoms to get attention, who weaponized medicine to maintain control. Angela closed her phone and pressed her hands against her face. She was being paranoid, jumping to ridiculous conclusions based on one small interaction with a baby she barely knew. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here, very wrong. The next day, she watched Jordan more carefully. Mr. Chen brought him out in the morning, laid him on the mat, and left him there for hours. Angela cleaned around him, dusted shelves within view, vacuumed the all way just outside the room. And she watched. Around mid-morning, sunlight broke through the fog and spilled across the hardwood floor. A bright rectangle of light moved slowly across the wall as the sun shifted. Jordan's eyes moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift in focus, a minute-tracking motion, but Angela saw it. She saw his eyes follow that patch of sunlight as it crept across the wall. Her pulse quickened. She moved to the side of the room, grabbed a bright yellow toy from a basket, some kind of plush duck, and held it at the edge of Jordan's field of vision. She moved it slowly, left to right, then back again. Jordan's eyes tracked it. Not perfectly, not with the focused attention of a baby with typical vision, but they moved, they followed, they tracked. Oh my God, Angela breathed. She glanced toward the doorway, empty, no one watching, no one seeing what she was seeing. Over the next week, Angela became a detective in her own quiet way. She started keeping notes in a small notebook she hid under her mattress. Day 6, Jordan turned his head toward my voice when I hummed, slight movement but definite. Day 7, eyes tracked sunlight across nursery wall for approximately 30 seconds. Day 8, reached toward bright object when no one else in room. Day 9, made sustained eye contact with me for 5+ seconds, smiled. The pattern became undeniable. When Mr. Chen was around, Jordan was completely unresponsive, a limp, vacant baby who showed no signs of awareness. When the cook walked through, nothing. When Samuel Harmon appeared briefly in the evenings, looking devastated and defeated, Jordan remained still and empty. But when Angela was alone with him, when no one was watching, Jordan came alive. Small responses, subtle movements, but they were real, they were there. Why would a baby respond to one person but not others? Why would his symptoms appear and disappear based on who was in the room? Unless the symptoms weren't real, unless something was making them happen on purpose. Angela's searches got more specific, more disturbing. Medications that cause blindness, drugs that suppress vision in babies. She found herself going down darker and darker paths, reading about pharmaceutical interventions, about eye drops and solutions designed for post-surgical patients, about substances that could temporarily impair visual function. It was insane, it had to be insane. But the more she watched Jordan, the more convinced she became that she was witnessing something deeply, criminally wrong. And then on day 12, she found the bottles. It happened during Jordan's morning routine. Angela was in the nursery putting away clean linens when Mr. Chen entered carrying Jordan and a small silver tray. Angela kept her head down, folding tiny onesies, trying to be invisible in the way she'd perfected over years. But she watched from the corner of her eye. Mr. Chen laid Jordan on the changing table and picked up something from the tray, a small glass bottle with a dropper. He tilted Jordan's head back with practiced efficiency and squeezed 2 drops into each eye. Jordan flinched slightly, his little face scrunched up, but he didn't cry. Mr. Chen set the bottle back on the tray and finished the diaper change without a word. Then he picked Jordan up and carried him out, leaving the tray on the dresser. Angela stood frozen, staring at that small glass bottle. Her hands shook as she approached it. She picked it up carefully like it might explode and read the label. OPTICOM solution 0.3%. For optic nerve sedation in post-surgical patients. Caution, not approved for pediatric use under 2 years. EXP August 2024. The bottle slipped in her sweaty grip. She caught it barely, her heart thundering. Sedation, not treatment, not therapy for blindness. Sedation of the optic nerve. And expired, the medication had expired 4 months before Jordan was even born. Angela turned the bottle over and over in her hands, reading and rereading the label as if the words might change, might make sense, might not mean what her racing mind was telling her they meant. Someone was putting drops in Jordan's eyes every morning, drops that sedated his optic nerves, drops that weren't meant for babies, drops that had expired. Someone was keeping this baby blind on purpose. The thought was so horrifying, so incomprehensible that Angela's knees went weak. She sat down hard on the floor, still clutching the bottle, trying to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Who would do this? Why? What possible reason could there be to deliberately blind an infant? She thought about Mr. Chen's flat, emotionless delivery of instructions, the way he handled Jordan like an object rather than a child, but he was just following orders, wasn't he? He wasn't a doctor. He wouldn't know what the medication really did. Dr. Crane, the doctor who diagnosed Jordan, she would know. She'd have to know what medication was being prescribed, what it did, why it was being used. Lang. Ella pulled out her phone with trembling hands and took photos of the bottle from every angle, making sure the label was clearly visible. Then she carefully set it back on the silver tray exactly where it had been. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed scrolling through medical databases, pharmaceutical references, anything she could access without credentials. Opticom solution, mechanism of action, side effects, contraindications. What she found made her feel physically ill. The medication was designed for adults recovering from complex eye surgeries, people with severe photosensitivity, people whose optic nerves needed to be temporarily suppressed to prevent pain and allow healing. In infants, the side effects were well documented. Delayed pupil response, reduced light perception, suppressed visual tracking, temporary but complete visual impairment that could last 6-8 hours per dose. In other words, the drops made babies appear blind. And if you gave them every single day for months on end, you'd create a perfect simulation of permanent blindness that would fool doctors, specialists, anyone who examined the child during the hours when the medication was active. Angela's notebook came out. She started tracking more carefully. 8:00 a.m. drops administered. 8:30 a.m. Jordan completely unresponsive, eyes glassy, body limp. 2:00 p.m. still no response to any stimuli. 3:30 p.m. first small movements, finger twitch, slight head turn. 5:00 p.m. eyes tracking light, turning toward sounds. 6:30 p.m. reaching for toys, making eye contact, smiling. 7:30 p.m. bedtime. The pattern was irrefutable. Every morning the drops went in. Every morning Jordan disappeared into a medicated fog, and every evening as the drugs wore off, he slowly came back to life. But only when no one important was watching. Samuel Harmon came home late, after Jordan was already asleep. Mr. Chen administered the drops when Jordan was at his lowest functioning. Any doctor's appointments would have been scheduled during peak medication hours. It was brilliant in the most evil way imaginable. Create blindness, get it diagnosed, maintain it through daily dosing, and no one would ever know the baby could actually see. But why? That was the question that kept Angela awake night after night. What could possibly motivate someone to do this to an infant? Money. Samuel was clearly wealthy, but Jordan being blind didn't seem to benefit anyone financially. Attention. From whom? Control over what? She needed to understand. More importantly, she needed proof that anyone would believe. So Angela started documenting everything. She took videos on her phone, short clips of Jordan tracking objects, making eye contact, responding to her voice. She noted times, doses, responses. She photographed the medication bottle from every angle. And she waited for the right moment to act because she knew that when she did, there would be no going back. That moment came 3 days later, on a late afternoon when Mr. Chen was running errands. The cook had left early, and Samuel wasn't expected home until after dark. Angela made a decision. She was going to give Jordan a bath, a late afternoon bath, 8 hours after his morning medication when the drugs should be fully worn off. She was going to see once and for all if this baby could really see her, if he could really connect, if everything she suspected was true. She filled the small plastic tub with warm water, tested the temperature 3 times, and gently lowered Jordan in. What happened next would change everything. The water was exactly the right temperature, warm but not hot, soothing against Jordan's skin. Angela supported his head carefully, one hand cradling his neck while the other guided him into the small bath. Jordan didn't cry, he didn't flinch. He lay in the water with unusual calm, his little body relaxed, his eyes open and clear. 8 hours since his morning dose, the medication should be completely out of his system by now. Angela picked up the soft yellow sponge and dipped it in the water. She squeezed it gently over Jordan's chest, letting warm water run across his skin. He shifted slightly, a tiny responsive movement that made her heart skip. "That's nice, isn't it, sweetheart?" she whispered, nice and warm. She moved the sponge to his arms, his shoulders, his tiny fingers. Everything slow and gentle, giving him time to process, to respond, to show her what she desperately needed.